Okay, you guys can start.
Great, so this is the Village of Mamaroneck Budget Advisory Committee meeting for the month of August 2020. We want to take a quick official roll call. Charles Guadagnolo here.
Ellen Hauptman.
Bill Sparrow.
Len Aubrey.
Dan Natchez. Charles, you need a motion to open the meeting.
I'll move to open the meeting.
With a second,
I second it.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, again, we're without John Fall and John Campbell this evening, but we appear to have a quorum. So we can move forward with the agenda that was circulated and published by Sally. Turning to the first topic. So last year, I think it was a critical exercise that we went through to map out our year and to try to give ourselves enough time, given timing and deadlines, to be prepared to accommodate the deadlines. And I think we did a good job of that throughout the year. And then things obviously got very challenging with the budget being adopted in the midst of a pandemic. But structurally, it seems like we stayed on point throughout most of the year, sticking to the framework that's on the screen, starting in December. And we now have, subsequent to this meeting, September, October, November to work with as well. And maybe we should talk about that a little bit, how we want to dedicate the next 3 months. But looking at this structure, I thought it worked pretty well, at least in terms of a framework, and our having broadly stuck to this. Does anybody want to comment on any of these items month by month, and if we need to make adjustments and add to this? And if not, we can try to use this going forward for next year as well.
Could you scroll down, Charles? Because at least I can't see the months and so on.
Is that any better?
No.
No.
Let's go back to the other screen. Okay, how is...
Oops. Yeah, that's okay. That's good.
That's good? Okay, cool.
Yep.
So I could talk us through it. I mean, we're all reading it and redigesting it. Again, we have 3 months leading up to December where there's probably quite a lot of territory to cover. But as we start to gain momentum with worksheets being available to be reviewed, that process starts. We then have committee membership in the month of December, and we can, revisit who's planning on continuing, and probably some of the issues with participation that have already been bridged that we can revisit as well. And in the event that we're going to need to find replacements, it's probably at least worth preemptively trying to get names of a couple of people who might be interested, both with respect to those that we've already discussed this with, for participation challenges, and then just general attrition. Again, utilizing, current budgets and expenditures as a basis. We've been through somewhat of that exercise that we can continue with. That would be December. January, a review of the adopted budget. February, committee recommendations to be provided by the end of February, leading into the Board of Trustees recommendations for late February, early March. And we'll probably talk about that process of engaging in Board of Trustees meetings as it relates to the capital budget that we'll talk about as part of tonight's agenda. Into March, reviewing the draft budget, things start to accelerate. There's the 6 to 8 meetings, probably trying to do a better job next year of getting broader committee participation to have presence at as many of those meetings as possible. April, the tentative budget gets adopted. We then quickly have to review and provide feedback and recommendations for the May 20th deadline, and we'll see if that tweaks at all for 2021, but presumably in May as well. So things move fast, so the more prepared we are going, into that April-May window, the better. Is everybody comfortable with this? Is there anything that we can do better to not feel pressed? I think we got better last year versus the year prior with both ourselves and with, Jerry being able to get us, information early. And we'll have the year to continue to talk about this, but for the time being, are you guys all relatively comfortable with this framework?
Yes.
Yeah, I am, Charles. This is Len. I guess it would be helpful, for us to have a conversation with Jerry or Dan Sarnoff, because given the pandemic, I'm not quite sure if anything will be different going into next year. That's all. I'm not sure if anything will be different, both I'm talking more from a process point of view, as I am from the financial situation in the village. Result in a change in process, I don't know.
I can tell you what the wish list, this is Dan Natchez, I can tell you what the wish list is, that the process has started earlier and is not forced to have a deadline at the last minute type thing, which is what has happened this year.
Yeah, but Dan, it's Ellen. I think part of this year's issue was the pandemic. I think that's why.
No, that was the tail end of it, but that had nothing to do with that had to do with the last few weeks. But the fact is that it was not a well coordinated approach to life to try and do this. There was meetings were put off for various and sundry reasons, and bunched together with very little time to adjust anything or do anything. I think, that may or may not happen, that it gets accelerated. We're going to see in terms of where we stand today. Augie's figures suggest that we are relatively on budget. The problem is that a lot of the issues that are large ticket items it's just how the reports come in. So that's an issue that we're facing. And I know Jerry is very much aware of it, as is Augie. And to determine, you have to keep watching it and determine what happens. I personally disappointed that we've been doing a lot of spending on things that are not essential. And I think that unfortunately, the meeting with the budget committee never took place, which talked about a lot of philosophical approaches of how to approach these things, which unfortunately never happened. So I know that's partially on your agenda for tonight, and hopefully we can bring that forward.
Dan, do you have, maybe a little bit more specifically with respect to the timeframes that are on the screen, where things could be accelerated and done earlier. I mean, what comes to mind is that you have a draft budget due the end of March.
We're trying to move, my conversations with Jerry, major part of the two major problems that we've had of recent date was to accelerate everything by a minimum of a month. They've already started in terms of capital budgeting issues for next year. And part of it is a carryover from this year. But it's very hard for people to focus on what to do next year when they're still trying to figure out what they can do tomorrow.
And I just want to put it out there that I understand that we were in a pandemic environment and it was difficult. It was a new forum with Zoom meetings and it just being a difficult challenge across the board. But I don't think the challenge of, if we look at this, that in April, that the committee is reviewing and providing feedback and recommendations, and then the deadline is the end of May. There's always going to be that tight window to work with. And, we see here that we start recommendations in February, but I think everybody needs to be prepared that if we're coming to the table with recommendations in April, that shouldn't come as a surprise and that it's too late in the game, and that's always going to happen. And again, our trying to stay ahead of it with the preliminary recommendations is probably the best way to mitigate that. But I just want to kind of state for the record that it's going to keep happening, and I just don't want to have that conversation again next year that it's too late, because otherwise, why are we even having the conversation?
My suggestion is to try and start earlier.
Well, we've got the work sessions in March, to your point. So, I mean, that 1 month would make a world of difference. Because it's the adoption of a tentative budget that are then being able to weigh in on as that final layer that, if we're going to do that, certainly that extra month would make a world of a difference. If that's achievable.
I think we should strive for it and see what happens. That's the best you can do.
It is.
Well, if Jerry and everyone are on board, Dan, with starting early, I guess maybe they've started already. I'm not quite sure. I think that's what you said. Then that's great.
Well, things in the last month have been absolutely upside down.
Sure, I guess so.
On 3 different fronts. So basically, nothing has been being done in that regard. So it's a question of trying to be proactive, and the more proactive I think you are, the better chances we have of speeding the process up.
Okay, so we'll keep that in front of us, and as part of the conversation amongst ourselves with Jerry, and collectively pushing to keep that accelerated time frame in front of us, and we'll see how it goes. And we'll go from there. Is everybody okay with this for the time being and to be continued?
Yes.
Guys,
Yes, Charles.
Great.
Yep.
And then I guess with that, and this probably is a good sequitur into the second item on the agenda, which is, subcommittee updates and next steps, is to just get feedback from the group about, how we want to prioritize September, October, November. There's, I think, a lot of subcommittee effort that can take place. Len and I can speak to the capital budget subcommittee and some ideas that we might have. But if we want to go around the horn, talk about the subcommittees that are in place, are we looking to keep all of these subcommittees? Is everybody comfortable with the subcommittees that they're on? Thoughts for topics for the subcommittees to focus on within their purviews. And then with that, how we want to spend the next 3 months topically leading up to the framework that we just looked at.
Charles, would you want to review the subcommittee that are currently in existence and their constituents?
I don't know if I'm going to pass that test. So Len and I are, and John Campbell comprise the capital budget subcommittee. Do you guys want to speak to your respective subcommittees? I don't know if that I'm going to pass the test.
Well, Ellen and I did work on the police, right? What we charge police, Ellen?
Yep.
Ellen actually did most of the work on that.
No, you did some too. Come on.
And we made a recommendation, right? I guess at one of our last meetings before the pandemic.
And it was accepted.
Okay.
So, but to that point, Jerry was the one who suggested we take a look at the overtime. So I think, I agree with Len, we're done with that bit.
Yeah.
So I think it would be beneficial if Jerry would have other suggestions of what we should be focusing on.
And then I think, Charles, we had the waterworks. I think that was another subcommittee, as I recall.
We certainly did, which I believe, Ed, that was yourself and Michael, who has I think moved and who's no longer on the committee,
Bill was on it,
and then Bill.
and Dan.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear which committee you were referring to.
Waterworks, Bill.
Waterworks, yeah, well. Right.
My concern about waterworks is what the trustees are interested in. It doesn't seem to be the same thing that we were working on. So I think we need better clarification about that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was the trustees. It's the mayor who is not anxious to have any discussions on the waterworks.
And he also seemed to feel that as long as there was litigation going on, none of our questions would be answered.
Right.
So that's a component of it, is whether that meeting should have taken place and the timing of that. There's the question of whether the topic falls within our purview, which I think was called into question. There's the question of, without the meeting, whether there's work to be done, which I would suggest that there is a ton to learn. It's quite complex. So there's that. And then collectively, and maybe as a subcommittee, are you guys interested in continuing as members of that subcommittee, and then the broader committee determining whether we feel comfortable and or the need to continue with this right now. We don't have to answer that this minute, but
I don't have a problem being on the committee. I just want to make sure that we are working on stuff that the board is interested in hearing us on.
Yeah. It seems as though the subject is a little bit delicate. We have Mr. Teachin out there, if you recall, with correspondence about 6 months ago between himself and Dan, and Tom. It's a little hard, I think, right now to determine what it is the committee ought to be doing.
I think it,
Go ahead, Ellen.
no, I was just gonna say, it's a very fine line because the operating budget or the overall operations of the waterworks really are not part of our committee's scope. However, we've all agreed in theory that if the water rates go up, there's a direct impact on the village, so we need to keep that in mind while we're reviewing the village budget in terms of increases, if that makes any sense. You know, kind of look at it in totality, even though we don't have any say with what's going on with the waterworks.
So rather than, dissolving this committee or committing to anything specific, it sounds like maybe next steps for the committee would be to get broad subsequent feedback from the Board of Trustees, including the mayor, as to, kind of where things stand, what the priorities with respect to the waterworks and our role in contributing analysis to this, where that stands, take that feedback, and then as a subcommittee and a committee, deciding how we intend to proceed. Does that sound reasonable?
Sounds fine with me.
Right. Dan, can you tell us, is the litigation still pending?
You have to speak up, Bill. I didn't hear you.
I inquired whether the litigation is still pending between, in regard to the waterworks.
I think I'm not sure I heard your entire question, so that's part of my problem here.
Yeah. I asked whether the litigation with the waterworks that has been referred to is still pending.
Bill, for some reason, we lose you halfway through what you said. I can hear
Okay.
the beginning, but I can't hear the last part.
Okay. Well, then there's some technical deficiency. I guess we'll just have to pass that.
We can hear you now.
I think the question is whether or not, Dan, the mayor or the board are interested in pursuing the waterworks questions. And that's the key issue, because
I can give the answer to that as the majority of the board is interested and the mayor is not.
okay, right. And the mayor
The mayor is liaison to the Westchester Waterworks and has said that he will not allow a meeting with the committee.
right. Okay.
And Bill, if I heard you correctly, you were also asking about where the litigation stood.
Yes.
To the best of my knowledge, nothing is happening at the moment.
Is there pending litigation, just no progress, or is there, that was dropped and there's
No,
no?
there's still pending litigation regarding Flagler Drive, which is what I think you're asking about. And that litigation is ongoing. There's not much activity at the moment. I don't know what the schedule is.
Okay. All right, so subcommittee wise, capital budget, waterworks. I believe we had and Ellen, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was did we lose Ellen?
No, I'm here.
Okay. There was the revenue Now, whether that falls within the operating budget at large, or if it was a specific, revenue sources of, et cetera, as a subcommittee that I think you were.
Well, what it really, it kind of started as looking at revenue or maybe expenses, but then we were following Jerry's guidelines on what to drill down on. So that's why I was saying before, it would be beneficial to get input from Jerry.
Okay, and just a thought is that, when we received all of the worksheets, that is a lot of information to digest. So, I mean, it could be a full-time job in itself, but so do you want to sort of take a revenue expense topic within the context of the operating budget, a subcommittee sort of being positioned with feedback from Jerry to?
I'm happy to drill down into anything based on requests to do it.
All right. So if you're talking about the waterworks in terms of, is that where you are, Charles?
No,
No, so I moved on from that. So basically, we have a capital budget and a waterworks subcommittee in place. There was the third, revenue expense subcommittee, called an operating budget subcommittee. And if we're looking to, sort of fill roles, at least with who's on the phone, if Ed and Bill were with the waterworks, Len and I were with the capital budget, and then Ellen on the revenue operating budget side, maybe with one other person. I don't know if John Fall is going to be able to really participate. John Campbell was part of the capital budget committee with me and Len. And that's a lot, Ellen, for you to be, effectively tackling alone.
well, it's not so much that it's a lot. I don't know what it is I'm tackling.
As well.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to tackle if somebody points me in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we talked about, and Ellen, I think you raised it, about the profitability of certain activities. Let's say some of the recreation type activities that we
Yep.
charge for, and so on. Looking at the relative expenses relative to revenue on selected activities that the village does. That was one of the things, Charles, that we had talked about, and we did focus on the police rates instead of that last year. I do think, it'd be helpful to have a conversation with Jerry on specific revenue or expense issues that he'd like to have looked at more closely, like overtime or, I don't know, maybe scheduling, because he put in the time cards. I'm not sure what's happened, what the impact of that has been.
Yep.
So,
I'll reach out to Jerry tomorrow.
Okay. I think we could probably leave the subcommittees at that. I mean, to your point, Ellen, that could go in so many different directions, and next steps would be the feedback from Jerry, to Len's point as well. And if you guys comfortable, we'll leave it at that for now, unless there's any other subcommittees that we specifically want to, either form or that are in quasi-existence that we want to talk about.
yeah, maybe Charles, if I could ask Dan, I just sense, I guess I've been on vacation, so but I don't have a sense right now of how the village is doing from a revenue expense in the current fiscal year, you seem to indicate that everything is going along pretty well relative to budget. And that's a surprise to me, but it's good news.
I don't want to mislead you on that. That's the last report we got. But as I indicated, it is in some respects a fallacious report because it does not have the tax revenue, what was paid and how much is in arrears. It did not have the certiorarities in it, and it did not have the well, so it's not it's real time for some of it, and it's potentially real time for others. Where the beach revenues were up, and the parking at the Harbor Island was up dramatically, in large part because Glen Island Park was closed. So that a lot of traffic came from there to here, and is still coming here, at least for the boat launching ramp. And that's all good revenue.
Good.
I thought Dan Sarnoff had reported at the last meeting, both with respect to sales tax revenue, also comparatively versus neighboring counties, and touched on the property tax arrear data, which the arrear, cases that were in arrears were actually down from last year, and it was seemingly negligible, which was a little surprising. And then secondly, that the revenue was, I think, down maybe 11% versus neighboring counties where it was like 30 to 40, which makes some sense given the wealth here, but it was, I think we interpreted that to be encouraging, that it was only down what it was. So I don't know what that,
As I say,
timeframe
Charles, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I don't want us to get comfortable in assuming that that's the trend, because most of the figures that you have mentioned are not current. They're current in terms of what was received on information, but time period is anywhere from 1 to 4 months back, if you will. It's not,
Not current.
So that becomes an issue, and that's something we're monitoring.
yeah, and maybe a suggestion would be that one of the considerations of the operating budget subcommittee would be to do that periodic, quarterly, if you will, check-in as to how we're trending, so that this committee can be abreast of where we stand, but just also keeping that information current and in front of everybody.
I'm happy to do that as long as Augie is willing to provide the information. Because I'm
think
not
so.
sure, and
I think
Dan,
so.
maybe you could answer this. I don't know how regularly he provides that.
Well, he's going to be providing it more often than he has in the past. Let me leave it like that.
Okay,
The board is very concerned about knowing where we are on every 2 weeks. But again, the information is not always current, so there is a lag, and that lag is what it is.
Parking revenue must be virtually nil for the first half of the year.
The railroad parking is nil, and there have been refunds to that. Part of the problem is that we don't, some of it has been offset, didn't we? You know, according to Augie's last information, we were slightly ahead of budget. But when I asked about the sales tax and, you know, certain other items, it's what we were getting at the time we were getting it. But that time, the time period being covered was 3 months earlier. Because there's that much of a lag time between, you know, from when it actually happens to when the funds are dispersed and you know where you are.
So Dan, question on the parking, the railroad parking reimbursements. So since the full year payment was due into February, early March, which was last year's fiscal year, I believe at our last budget meeting, Dan Sarnoff said we had $1 million in surplus from last year. But where did the reimbursements come from, last year or this year?
I can't answer the question. I assume it would be this year.
It's kind of funky accounting, but okay.
So if we're good on subcommittees for the time being with some next steps with that, and there's a lot to that, we can all talk offline independently as subcommittees about some of the things that we want to focus on. I think that'll keep us very busy, but do you guys have feedback and thoughts about September, October, November leading up to the framework that we looked at?
I would say that the information that Ellen is going to be getting would be the most important information. So we get a sense of how, you know, the village is doing in relation to the budget it's living under. Whether it's, you know, everything is okay, whether it's going to be problems. And be ready to look at what they can do if there are problems.
And I would also say, whatever Jerry recommends we look at could be more than just me, and we could be doing that over the next 3 months.
Absolutely.
Well, I think from a board's perspective, focusing on the capital budget and on a rolling basis would be exceedingly helpful, both in terms of principle and concept of, you know, how it should be viewed. And I believe there are other members of the board who feel the same way.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's a task in itself. You know, Len and I can probably talk more about that. And then, you know,
Yeah.
as part of what we do, bring issues similarly the way that Ellen will on the operating budget side, and kind of plug that into agendas over the next 3 months to get the larger committee's feedback on.
Well, my suggestion is you may want to think about if you can finalize the capital budget planning principles document, asking to meet with the board in the second meeting in September, so that it can be fully aired.
The second meeting in September, so the latter half of September, there's 2 meetings a month now.
The board meets twice a month, the second and fourth Mondays, but the concern is that the first meeting is the day before your meeting. So your committee has to finalize something to bring to them. So if you finalize it at your September meeting, you can then be in a position to present it to the board at the board's second meeting in September.
Funny, this year, the 7th, the first Monday is Labor Day. And our meeting is the 8th, I think, because it's the second Tuesday. Kind of weird, but
I don't have the dates in front of me, but, we can work that out. But I would suggest that that might be something you want to think about.
yeah.
Which is a good sequitur to the last agenda topic, and I'm just going to pull up the document that Ellen had further edited.
So we had all approved the document previously. But based on our last meeting and some of the things I learned in talking to Augie, I had recommended a couple of changes, and those are only on the first page in red. Haven't touched anything else.
Can you see the document with the red that I pulled up?
Yes.
No,
No,
You can't. Okay.
no.
I can.
Excuse me, Ellen,
yeah,
I sent you some language suggestions. Did you get my?
yeah,
email?
I saw it, and I'll explain what I'm trying to get at, because maybe my wording's not good either, but I don't think your wording gets to what I was trying to fix.
Okay,
So based on my conversation with Augie, what goes into the debt service plan for the current fiscal year and it's in the operating budget is only the debt service for the bonds that have already been issued.
Yes, of course.
Right, so if we have a capital plan for the next fiscal year, the bonds haven't been issued for it yet, but could be issued during the year. That debt service is not planned for. So right off the bat, we have an over plan condition because we're continuing to spend capital funds. So that's what I was trying to get at when I added budgets should include the capital projects in the debt service plan for the right fiscal year, because we're not doing that now. And your wording, Ed, is capital plans should include future known capital projects in the debt service plan for the appropriate fiscal year. So it's not the capital plans that need to include the debt service, it's the operating budget that needs to include the debt service.
I understand what you're saying.
You do or you don't?
I do. I understand. I'm just trying to figure out how we can change the language to, because a budget is a budget. The budget.
Right, but I'm recommending the budget include that. So if we know that we can basically absorb to keep that same 7.5% level of the operating budget, 4 to 8 million a year, and I'm making this up, numbers as we talk. So this year, this is a real number. The current fiscal year's debt service plan is 3.7 million. Let's pretend it could, to keep us at the 7.5% of the overall operating budget, it could be 4.5 million. We should budget that remaining 800,000 as part of the debt service to cover new bonds that are issued in the current fiscal year, or to start building up a capital reserve for those years where we're spending way more money.
Well, we're in other words, where a capital project is an emergency almost, and we have to spend more money that we haven't budgeted or planned for.
Why is a capital project an emergency? For example, we just approved the new fire engine. That's approximately 60,000 a year in debt service. That's not planned. That's not an emergency.
Well, they viewed it as an emergency because there was pressure on them to get rid of the old one. that it was nearby, as I understood it, it was near, it was just too old. It couldn't, it just.
Yeah, I'm questioning your word emergency. To me, an emergency is something that's totally unplanned.
Let's say unexpected, or, well, anything that's, that they decide this needs to be done now, that,
Right, so we had all the departments submit a 5-year capital ask. I don't want to say plan, but
right,
they all submitted what they want to do over the next 5 years. We should be using those requests and properly fund the debt service part of the operating budget. That's what I'm trying to get to.
okay,
So Dan Sarnoff at the last meeting, or in a separate conversation, I don't remember which, said that Augie was issuing a new bond now. So whatever interest payment, P&I payments we have to make this year, completely over plan. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
right.
Len, you're usually pretty good at
I don't know if you can
noodling this
avoid it.
stuff.
If they decide that this needs to be done, I mean, but it had it, one of the good suggestions in the document is that we, even when we don't have enough, we have less debt to pay than the 7.5%. We should use that to build up like a rainy day fund for when
Yep.
we need to use for a capital thing that becomes necessary to do that we didn't anticipate.
Right, that's the next bullet.
Yeah,
And
but
we-
we combined. I mean,
We need to revisit with Augie, because I thought we had raised this at one of our first meetings. Whether you can legally do that, because then you're effectively financing a reserve, or whether you're obligated legally to use the,
We're not financing we're not financing the reserve.
I know that that wouldn't be the intent, and
No, but we're not issuing debt to finance it.
No, but I think what Ellen is raising is a good point. If the process is to issue bonds during the year, whether it's at the beginning, middle, or third quarter of the year, there is expenses that are incurred regarding that, both to issue it in debt service for the remainder of that fiscal year. And there should be in the budget itself, a line item for that type of thing.
Yep,
I think that's what you're advocating. Am I correct, Alan?
yes, I just don't know how to word it correctly.
Well, I think my own opinion is the bullet that begins generally is very clear to me. I think, quite frankly, we're getting a little bit too much into the weeds here with respect to that point. I think it's quite clear that says that in the current budget year, we must include as part of the debt service line item or separate line item, current year projects that will be financed by village debt. So that seems quite clear.
To me, that first sentence doesn't say that, Len.
Which first sentence? Generally?
Yeah,
It says generally the village can finance. We should clear that up. 4 to 8. We've been saying that for months.
right.
In new capital projects annually and maintain. Well, if that's not true, then we should change it. In other words, if it's not true that we can finance $4 to $8 million in projects, then that sentence has to change dramatically.
Okay, so what I learned after you, Ed, and I got together to put this document together
Yeah.
was what Augie budgets for debt service is only the debt service on bonds that are in place.
Okay, so not new projects.
Right, so that was the gap I'm trying to close.
Okay. Then how would you edit the first sentence?
I don't know. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, but we
That's
never.
why I added the red sentence. What?
Well, that's very easy to say. Really what we have to introduce here, the fact that we feel that the debt service should be no more than 7.5% of the operating budget.
Okay,
And that 7.5% should include existing debt service plus any new current year projects. I'm
perfect.
not stating it very elegantly, but what has
Oh,
to
good. I'm glad you're typing, Charles.
what has to come out is the 4 to 8 million in new capital projects. Because now that you say that, Ellen, now I do remember you raising that issue after the three of us met.
Yep.
So you gotta be, but I think that the amount was important to have it in there, that for budgeting, for planning purposes, this is the range of capital projects the village can finance. And
Well,
be within the 7.5%.
well, yes and no. So in talking to Augie, he said nothing to very little in our current debt was dropping off this fiscal year. So there might be very little at the tail end. So we're not getting the 4 to 8 million hit for the whole year.
Well, maybe we
So-
should take out the word new.
No, but I think the way Len just said it, so it's really a whole rewrite, Charles. It's not an edit. And I'm probably gonna bastardize what Len just said, was that we are recommending that the debt service component of the operating budget be no greater than 7.5% of the operating budget.
That's really a new recommendation. I mean, because we haven't previously considered whether 7.5% is the right number.
We approved this document before.
Bill, we did approve it. I mean, but it's based on our understanding of what the Augie told us, that that's what they do.
But that's just that's precedent. And I thought he had indicated that he typically doesn't raise debt mid-cycle, but it sounds like he just did. So
He just did.
Well, I think, yeah, we have to find out more about that maybe from Augie.
And Ellen, I do want to clarify, because to your point, you know, if we're saying 7.5 is the max, that if you don't end up needing it, that it can be applied to reserves would be helpful. And then also, you know, potentially indirectly being able to finance the reserves if they've been depleted to get that number back up. And
Yep.
I don't know if you can
So
do
if it-
that, if you
No, if
will.
it's not financing, because financing is bonding. What it is just doing is building up a reserve. Try not to use the word financing.
Yeah, it's not financing. You're not issuing bonds for a reserve. Yeah.
Well, where I'm going with that though is that if you issue the bond and then you end up coming in under budget, and I don't know if that's where you were going, Ellen, but if you end up having a differential off of that debt issuance, can that be allocated to?
No, it's not. No, the debt issuance doesn't occur. So let's pretend right now we had absolutely no debt. And we're undertaking a capital project that's going to cost 5 million. I don't think Augie can issue that bond until we have spent the 5 million. I'm 90% sure of that.
Okay, we gotta check that.
Yeah, but it's after the fact. It's not in anticipation of spending.
Okay, it's a reimbursement bond.
Right, it would come out of the money comes out of the reserves and then it gets paid back when the bond's issued.
Do you know that, Dan?
Yes, that's what happened.
That's what happens?
So it's clearly not a financing for future use, but it is building up a reserve for future use. So if there is a year, let's stick with this 4 to 8 million that we can absorb in a given year. There's a year where we have to absorb 20 million. That's going to put the debt service greater than 7.5%. But if we have a built up reserve, we may be able to lessen that impact.
Well,
But
it'll
regardless,
still be-
all I was trying to
But
get
my
to,
suggestion is, I think you're thinking of reserves in the wrong regard. You have two pockets. One is where you pay something and one is where the money stays when when you finish paying for it. So if there is excess money, it stays in the pocket. I don't think, I'm not sure the concept of, well, if you are under 1 year, you can use it in another year, is a valid concept. I think what you do, you're better off as keeping to a number of the, let's call it the 7.5%, which you previously agreed to. And if you exceed it, you exceed it. And if you're under, you're under. But at least it's a target that says, okay, Mr. Village, you need to plan for these things in a way to try and be prudent and stay within a specific range. And if you are exceeding it, you need to know that you're exceeding it and determine whether or not that's a prudent thing to do or not. For instance, if the new infiltration plan gets accelerated, which it will not, it'll be stretched over a longer period of time probably. But if it got accelerated, you'll exceed it. Our share is I think it's $29 million. Spread over maybe 5 years of construction, but let's assume that you did it over 3 years of construction. It's a big hunk of money. So I think you should try and stick to whatever the concept of what you're trying to do from budgeting. And I agree that it should include, whatever debt service there, that will be paid that year. Which is for past projects that are funded, and if you are incurring additional expenses in the current year.
which in essence, Dan, then means, and that's what I was getting at, that the board basically, before the operating budget's approved, the board pretty much has to have reviewed the capital asks from the department and have a pretty good idea on what you're going to approve and what you're not.
Correct. And more importantly, they should be doing it under the philosophy of how much we should be, if there's a limit of what we should be doing, i.e. prioritizing what we need to do. And if we
Yep.
put something off to another year, do so. But that's, I think, the message you may want to consider bringing to the board.
That's in here as well.
Yeah, I think.
I understand that, but it hasn't gotten there yet.
No, that we had already approved. It was just my red stuff that I added after the last meeting.
you want to, rather than trying to finalize this document now, take the feedback from this conversation and we can digest it and circulate suggestions and then try to, as we go back then to the timing of this, to Dan's earlier point.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Charles. Ellen, are you gonna call Jerry tomorrow?
Yes,
I think it would be helpful just to confirm that how they finance projects, assuming they're not funded by the feds or anything. In other words, that it's done on a, I'll call it a reimbursement basis. In other words, the village puts out the cash, just to confirm that Dan said, but if that's the way it's done, and typically then it's the end of the year, presumably.
Actually,
Except-
it's about halfway through.
All right, or halfway, okay.
so the fact that we just issued a new bond without debt service in the plan makes no sense.
Well, what's the structure then? If it's a reimbursement bond, do we start immediately paying back principal and interest? If so, when? Do we immediately pay principal and interest on debt issued by the village?
And Len, I'd asked Augie if he could sit with us and maybe, as a group or as a subcommittee and look at his spreadsheet
Yeah,
that kind of shows those amortization schedules, because it might be easier to conceptualize it if we can actually see the durations and just how it's amortized. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Alan, if you could initiate it with just getting clarity on the broad topics, and then maybe we could dive into the weeds and really better understand the models.
Yep.
yeah. No, thank you, Charles, yeah.
So if you get that feedback, if we circulate the document, leading up to the next meeting, can hopefully adopt the revised document and then plan for the second meeting in September to make the presentation, or have that work session. Dan, what would the process be timing wise to effectively get on that agenda?
If you authorize me to do so, I will request it to be done.
If anybody wants to make a motion for Dan to propose to the board that we be able to, the previously scheduled that got canceled, to target that for the second meeting in September.
I'll move that.
We have a motion from Bill.
I'll
Right.
second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Right.
I will do so and copy the committee on it.
Thank you.
I think that kind of brought us to the end of the agenda. Was there anything else that anybody wanted to talk about? Can we get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
Everyone sounds so happy. Been a bad week,
Up
huh?
zooming.
Meeting adjourned. That was productive. All right. Well, I guess everybody have a great Labor Day, and we'll see you the Tuesday after Labor Day.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Thanks a lot, Charles, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Ciao, ciao.